what about people on the far right might appeal? Like, why is Irishness so welcome in that community?
I mean, I think in some ways it's a way to get away with invoking whiteness without having to invoke the word whiteness.
Hello and welcome to the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast. I'm your host, Dave Baumeister, and with me today is my good friend in the Steel City, that is the city of steel bridges and beams and wires and whatnot, and stealing from your neighbor. No, not that kind of stealing. Of course, the Steel City, Pittsburgh, and that's Aidan Beatty. So Aidan Beatty is a historian who teaches at Carnegie Mellon University. Previously was at the University of Pittsburgh. They're an expert in Irish history and political history, history of ideologies, the history of the Middle East and of Israel, history of property and concepts of property. And in our conversation, we covered this and a bunch of other ground, including Irish identity and the role of Irishness in contemporary politics, including Trump-esque right-wing politics today in the U.S. and in that cultural moment. So I think you're going to enjoy this conversation. Thanks for tuning in here for this chat with Aidan Beatty on the Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast. So Aidan, let's dive in with talking about some history, some philosophy, some politics, some contemporary world, some Europe, some America. So maybe my first question, let me ask you about this. Like, give us a nutshell of who you are, and by way of that, like maybe on this question too, of you're a European living in America, and how does that feel for you? Who are you? Why are you there? And along those lines.
Sure. So I am originally from a very small town on the west coast of Ireland, and I went to university in Dublin from 2005 to 2009. And for a number of different reasons, I got really interested in Middle Eastern history. So I came to the US basically to do a PhD in Israeli and Palestinian history, which then sort of grew into more of a PhD on comparing Ireland and Israel and contrasting them in some ways too. And then I got married to an American and basically stayed. So I've been here more or less since 2009. There was a period where I went to Canada for about a year as a researcher, was back in Ireland for about a year doing research, go back pretty regularly to Ireland still. Mm-hmm. And because I do a lot of Irish history, I'm still fairly connected to Ireland, either literally connected and just going back there regularly, or just connected in the abstract, in that yes. I'm just sort of always reading about Ireland and thinking about Ireland in some ways. So I guess thinking about a certain part of Europe also. Mm-hmm. And then a lot of the work I do as a historian is on issues to do. What I've come to realize is really I'm a historian of ideologies, and that's what I'm really interested in. Is like the sort of constructed ideas of what the world is like that people carry around inside their own heads and how those actually work. So I'm interested in things like capitalism and socialism, masculinity, white racial identity, anti-Semitism, all of which are in different ways of understanding why the world is the way it is and where you fit, where you as a person fit into the world. Mm-hmm. I think.
And for you, that
yeah.
So would you say that you've also broadened out from? I mean, if your initial interest was in the Middle East, on that comparative project, and I believe you still work on that topic to some extent. But what you're describing there with being a historian of ideologies, but you didn't realize that at first, and then only lately you've come to kind of think that your interest all along has been ideologies in the broad sense, or do you think that that's crystallized as your interest in this kind of point of your career?
I think I was interested in that all along, but I didn't know why I was interested in that or what exactly it was that I was interested in. And I've tended to, it seemed to me at least, and probably to others too, that I was jumping around to a few different things. And as I try to just think about what actually unifies them all, and why am I doing this, and what is the kind of unifying thread to all of this, I think it is that question of ideologies that has really like unified all of them, all these different random things or seemingly random things that I'm working on.
Like in conceiving ideology generally, let's talk about that for a little bit. Like, do you feel that, I mean, there's a bunch of different ways of conceiving ideology, and I like the idea of ideology. And in philosophy, you know, there's many people also, I think there's many strains within philosophy whereby ideology is the central kind of component of analysis and theorizing, while at the same time others, you know, maybe see ideology as a more narrow, like, oh yeah, that's just ideology, but there's more to the world than ideology, and we're going to focus on these other things. And they almost kind of minimize the role of ideologies at times. And I suppose, do you, like, how broad do you see ideologies reaching? Like, are there places in society that are non-ideological, or in your interest in ideology, do you feel like that can kind of almost gets you to anywhere you want to think about?
Yeah, I think more so the latter, that it can kind of mean anything, or it can have multiple different permutations. And I would sort of take the idea that like people like Michel Foucault have had, that when people start saying, oh, we're being non-ideological, we're being non-political, that's usually a good sign that they're actually being incredibly ideological and incredibly political. That's one of the most ideological things you can claim, is that this is not ideology, this is just rational common sense. So I tend to be quite skeptical when people make those claims. I would say initially, one of the people that has had a big impact on me as a historian is a kind of a writer who works on the borders between sociology and history, called Immanuel Wallerstein. And his view of ideology is that it's just the way that you legitimate the world. And I like that, but I think it can be a bit limited too, because it kind of removes emotion in a way from the equation, and it removes it makes it seem almost like transactional, like you're just believing things because it suits you, because it has some kind of material benefit to you to believe this. And
like you need a justification for like, and with Wallerstein, it's correct me if I'm wrong, but that's world systems theory, right? So it's almost like different systems, different ideologies accompany different world systems, and they interact with one another. And so it's like, but you're trying to point out, you think ideology is a bit deeper than that.
Because I think people
what it means to people.
People do genuinely believe things. It's not just a kind of superficial, two-dimensional thing. So, I mean, a few years ago, I was writing a book where I had one chapter on Edmund Burke, like the late 18th century philosopher and statesman and politician. And he has this whole sort of thread that runs through a lot of his political writings about you need property owners to have a stable society, and property owners should be kind of the center of political action and of how you structure the state. And some people who are a bit cynical about Burke would point out that he was a property owner, and he owned a lot of property in Ireland, and then later owned some property in Britain, and was a landlord essentially. And you could kind of fall into the trap of thinking, well, he only believes this because he is a property owner. And if he hadn't been a property owner, he would have just been would have had a very different set of politics. And I think that kind of empties out how much he genuinely did believe this, right? He did feel that society should be structured in a certain way because property ownership gives stability to the structure of society. So you can't just reduce him to being a kind of self-interested, selfish person. There's actually some deeper motivation for him. So that's really what I'm trying to get at, that I like what Wallerstein was saying, but I think you have to go a little bit beyond that to recognize that people do genuinely believe things, and they're not just being kind of transactional or two-dimensional or something like that.
Yes, that there's something else there. And I wonder, like, what that makes me think about, thinking about that in terms of history of philosophy, which is often, maybe there's like slightly different vocabulary, but it's maybe, I think, equivalent points being made. That it's almost with the example from Burke there, that there's like an argument, like it may be the case that he was, like in terms of his class and his race and his position, like kind of inclined or predisposed to favor the system that aligned with his interests. But at the same time, there is like force of an independent argument there. Like he had some convictions, and, I guess that's the question, is that belief, or is it the case that there is, there's more of a justification for that, Burkean conservative position. I think about this with Kant, or with historical philosophers, but Kant's the figure I've worked on the most with regards to this, and in particular with Kant's racism, and how you deal with like problematic notions in these thinkers, because there's always this tendency to be like, well, they're a product of their time, or they harbored some implicit bias or hatred or something on some level, and that manifested here. But that also, I feel, maybe in a parallel way to the example with ideology, it doesn't give enough credit to the fact that, well, maybe this is actually what this person believes, and there's an argument for them there. And in a way, you in order to really understand how ideologies work, maybe, and how they transfer, you need to recognize that deeper part of it, that we're not just automatons, spouting out ideology. We also contribute to them actively, maybe even freely.
Yeah, I would think part of this is the difference between being an ideologue and being a philosopher, or being like an actual intellectual or thinker. So in that book, I also had a chapter about a much more obscure man called George Fitzhugh, who wrote 2 books in the 1850s that are basically defenses of slavery. He lived in Virginia in the United States, and in the first book, called Sociology for the South, what can be weird about that book is it almost sounds like a socialist text, right? He says, like, it's this like really vicious denunciation of the northern United States, and he takes a lot of ideas from socialist literature of the 1850s. He's probably reading the New York Daily Tribune, and the European correspondent for that newspaper was Karl Marx. So he's actually taking kind of Marxist and quasi-Marxist ideas and then using it to denounce the North and say, well, the North is the real home of oppression in the United States. And then he constructs this image of the southern United States as being really peaceful and harmonious, and it's peaceful and harmonious because it has slavery.
Okay.
And then he wrote a second book called...
And it's the idea that there also that it's peaceful and harmonious for everybody, that also the slaves themselves benefit from this model or something.
Oh yeah, I mean he very much takes this idea of like there's just happy slaves working away, and they don't need to be bothered by abolitionists and people like that. And then he wrote a second book called Cannibals All, where he completely changes his mind, or at least that's what it can seem like, where he just says the real danger with abolitionism is it's going to bring socialism, and socialism is evil. So he's a kind of quasi-socialist writer, and then he's an anti-socialist writer, because none of this is actually stuff that he believes. He just wants to defend slavery, and that's like hyper-ideological writing. There are ways in which Burke, he has these ideological biases, or kind of implicit bias, if you want to call it that. And there's things he says about Black people, about Jews, about women, that are kind of like what you're talking about Kant. Those are kind of biases, bigotries that they're carrying with them. But then there's things that Burke says about French society in the years leading up to the French Revolution that's really, really perceptive, where he is allowing his thoughts to go in a number of different directions. Like there's much more of a free thinkingness to him than there would be to someone like Fitzhugh. Even though they're both like conservative writers. I mean, Burke is an actual intellectual and Fitzhugh is an ideologue. And I think if you just assume that these people are ideologues, I think you end up being kind of limited. What do you do with like these random statements that these people can make, that even like quite perceptive, brilliant people, and then they will just come out and say something really hideous, or that we today would see as totally hideous? I think that's a really fascinating question, and including for people, I assume like you with Kant, that like you genuinely respect, and yet they have these really nasty edges to them. I don't know what you do with that. I don't know if you have how do you deal with that, Kant?
Yeah, I guess in short, what I'd say is I like that inconsistency. Like, it actually makes me like Kant more. Oddly, for him to have these flaws, it just makes as a thinker, the whole project a bit, it seems more fraught. But I think I have an easier time handling that, and it's attractive to me because I'm not many people who work on somebody like Kant in philosophy, as I'm sure there are with many people in history, especially like maybe biographical historians and such. Like, they focus on a figure because they agree with that figure, and they kind of, in philosophy, that happens all the time. It's like, you're a Hobbesian, or an Aristotelian inspired thinker today or whatnot, or, or a Rawlsian or more recent, but it's basically just people like to align their position with that of someone in the past. And then they more or less adopt a position of defense vis-a-vis that person in the past, or trying to always provide the most sympathetic possible version of that past thinker. And I think maybe the majority of people who work on someone like Kant, that's what their posture towards Kant is that. And I think that's maybe understandable, but my posture is just different. Like, I've never seen Kant as, fully correct or something, or I don't see, but that's just, I approach him as he's just this really interesting, crucial figure who I think does get a lot of things. I wouldn't want to say right, but at least there's incredible insight in many of Kant's works. But he's just, he was working at, at this juncture, the birth of anthropology, the shift, kind of the emergence of the human sciences and things, where he had a huge influence. But he's just interesting, and for me, interesting is enough. And someone is more interesting when they have these blemishes or these sort of structural flaws. And I think it's also okay to read those as features of their system and not as bugs. I'm kind of inclined in that way. But what's your, maybe like, let me ask you to reflect a little bit on that. So you made this distinction between intellectuals and ideologues, which I like a lot. And then I wonder, how do minds and intellects of the past impact your thinking as a historian today? And maybe because I know in your work, certainly say like the 2023 book on property, right? Like, there's the first half deals with historical thinkers and things. So like, what value is there to looking at previous, philosophical, intellectual positions, historical positions, sociological ones for you today?
So I think, the person I'm sort of really want to kind of push towards in answering that question would be Marx, because I think he is someone that, it's not just that he said things that are really interesting and valuable, but that there's a whole kind of body of literature that comes out of his writings that I find really valuable, and that I am always sympathetic towards and find really useful in terms of understanding how society works. In that book, I looked at three big thinkers that I saw as kind of starting mightn't even be the right word, but at least like formative thinkers in terms of how we today think about private property. And those were Burke, Locke, and, well, I guess four thinkers, because it was Marx and Engels.
But they kind of meld into one. They count as one in this case.
To a certain degree, yeah. So with Locke, there's a problem with reading him almost like as too forward, like too much in terms of what comes after him. And you have to kind of recognize that there are some ways in which he's actually looking backwards to earlier writers. So if you're trying to use him to understand modernity or something like that, you almost have to be kind of selective in what you take from him. And I think Burke in some ways is similar, because there's a lot of debate about Edmund Burke. The kind of cliched thing to say about him is he's the father of modern conservatism. And he is, but he's actually not a conservative in his own time. He's an 18th century liberal, but what you can actually really see with him is a shift within liberalism caused by the French Revolution, and where liberals are actually splitting on the question of should you support the revolution or not. And he is very much in the camp of this is not something to support in any way, right? Not just that you'd be slightly critical of it, but that it's a terrible state of affairs that should be absolutely opposed by every right-thinking person in Europe. what I find in some ways quite useful about Marx, and it's maybe useful about him as a kind of progenitor of a way of thinking, is he's much more of a 20th century figure than he is a 19th century figure. And, you know, if I've taught the Communist Manifesto and texts like that in classes that I've taught, one thing I often emphasize is most of what Marx is talking about hasn't yet happened. He kind of sees this coming. He sees like industrial development and things like that, and he sees a way of existing within industrial capitalist society that is really only existing maybe in Britain, and even there it's very embryonic at the period that he's writing about. And maybe this is also a function of how his ideas actually get repurposed quite a bit, and get kind of almost rewritten and reimagined in coming into the 20th century. So he can kind of feel more modern than he actually is. But I do think there's something quite like 20th century-esque about him rather than 19th century. So I think he can be quite a useful figure if you take him cautiously. And I think he's someone that has a similar set of problems to what you were talking about Kant. And I mean, in some ways also makes him quite interesting and quite a fun person to grapple with, because then, you know, he can be very, very perceptive and interesting, and then he will say something that is just totally wrong. But it becomes really interesting to think, well, why is he saying this wrong thing? And it's not just that he is not seeing something, or is sort of has blind spots. It's he's choosing not to see something, or he's choosing to have a bias or something like that. So one of the things I was quite interested in about Marx, maybe unsurprisingly, given my own personal background and my professional background, I was really interested in how he writes a lot about Ireland. And he completely talks about Ireland as like this very agrarian, agricultural space and agricultural economy. And that's true up to a point, but it also completely ignores that, like, Belfast in already in the period that he's writing about and was himself working, is one of the most industrial cities in the world. It's heavily, heavily industrialized, and he completely ignores that part of Ireland that's much more industrialized and doesn't fit, because he's actually trying to think through a load of problems about what is an agrarian society and what happens when an agrarian society gets pulled into capitalism and is producing agrarian goods for an industrial economy. So he just chooses to ignore like this other side of the country of Ireland, which I find really interesting, and sort of like he's a philosopher who is using history so as to make a number of kind of philosophical economic arguments about the nature of capitalism and about agrarian peripheries and things like that.
But then as a historian, would you say that means, so like in the selection of the Ireland in a sort of narrow way as an exemplary for agrarian society, so that's like, then do you think that as a historian there he kind of fails? Or in some regards, like, you know, he's not, if he uses that and that helps out his philosophy, then what about, how does that impact his, in other words, like you as a historian, do you there's that double-sidedness, like, what do you do with that?
So I think one thing you could do is just say, well, he's just wrong, right? And there's a whole lot of things he misses. And there's things he just never talks about that you would almost think like it's actually kind of frustrating, like that he doesn't talk about these things. He never mentions religion at all in Ireland, which is very odd given how central religion is to so much of what goes on in Ireland in the 19th century and well into the 20th century. That there's this huge sectarian divide he has almost nothing to say about. So that can be a little bit frustrating, because I would have loved to know what did he think of that. And I'm sure he would have had smart things to say. I do think it's to be sympathetic to him, and I think you have to have a certain kind of sympathy for all people that you read, not necessarily like a political sympathy, but like a willingness to sort of go to kind of read along with them and say, well, why are they making this argument? and I think you have to recognize that he is, as you say, like he's a philosopher doing history, or he's using history for his philosophy. So he has to be read in that way, that he's not trying to write pure like classic history. He's trying to make a philosophical argument through history, and that's, you know, if that is what he's trying to do, that's, you know, there are some really smart things there and kind of useful things there. There is like a kind of a divide in the literature on Marx in terms of people who just solely read him as a 19th century thinker. So like Jonathan Sperber, that had a biography of him several years ago, I think the subtitle of it was something like A 19th Century Life. And he just sees him as,
so just kind of situating him in that context, and that's kind of the main, really the only legitimate horizon with which to understand him.
Yeah, and then there's people like David Harvey who, you know, will write analyses and kind of commentary on capital, and then we'll be talking about Walmart and Tesco and things like this, like these very 21st century problems, and saying, well, we can use Marx. And in a way, like reading him as a historian gives you a very different text than reading him as a philosopher. And I'm kind of more, in a way, like, even though I'm a historian, I'm much more sympathetic in some ways to the, like, politically sympathetic to that philosophical reading, because you can do similar things with, you know, with Aristotle, with Kant, with Plato, with Machiavelli. They are kind of universal thinkers in some ways, and they say something larger than just what they're saying about their own specific time period.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think that's a great way to put it. And then when we thinking from the present, you know, turning back to this question, it's like, what value is there to focusing on historical figures or thinkers in theorizing about the world today? Like, why not just be fully presentist? And, you know, we don't need any of those. That's maybe just the occasional footnote or something, like, you know, but all that dusty stuff in the background is just, you know, overly obscure to the moment. So do you, I guess this is like my last question before we take a break, but would you, do you feel that empowers you as a thinker of the moment? Or maybe let me put it this way too. Do you consider your work also addressed to the present, or are you, as a historian, mostly a historian of the past?
I think any historian who's being totally honest with themselves and with others will admit that they are kind of presentist. I was recently talking about this with some students of mine about, in American history writing, there's a thing usually called the cultural turn, where cultural history became the really dominant mode of writing history in the United States in the late 20th century and coming into the early 21st century. And then right at 2008, there's a big shift in American history writing, and people start writing about capitalism. And it's very obvious to know why they're doing that. After the credit crisis and the subprime mortgage crisis and things like that in the US, people recognize, wow, we need to think about capitalism. That is a thing that is having a big determining impact on the development of American society. And I think if I look at a lot of the things that I'm interested in historically are things that I'm kind of interested in politically. Questions of identity, questions of masculinity, things like capitalism and socialism. It would be really disingenuous, I think, to say, oh, I'm just sort of completely being objective and I'm studying these things because they're just fascinating in isolation. They're fascinating to me personally, on some kind of personal, political, ideological level. To go back to your statement about like should you just be totally presentist if you're trying to understand the world? What I would say as a historian is nobody is totally presentist. We're all determined by the pasts that we've inherited. So like to go back to Marx in the 18th Brumaire, he says, like, very famously, everyone makes choices in their own. Everyone makes their own choices in life, but never in conditions of their own choosing. because the past weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living, and we've inherited all these traditions from the past, and those really determine what choices we can make in the present. So to understand the present, you need the past. And just thinking that we live in a kind of perpetual present tense would actually be quite a bad choice to make, I think.
Yes. No, well said. I like that a lot. The kind of yin and yang, the inescapable like togetherness of the past and the present, and maybe the future too. We could talk about that after the break, perhaps. It's like, in the future. But I like how you wove that together very much. So all right, well, let's take a quick break. Then we'll be back to chat more with Aidan Beatty.
Like Friday of last week, I had like 3 wisdom teeth removed. So I'm kind of very limited in what I can and cannot eat still. Like I have to eat very soft foods at the moment.
Okay. Yeah. Oh man. Yeah. Well, that's probably the wise thing to do. I guess getting those teeth out didn't remove all your wisdom. So I have a question for Aidan Beatty here, and I'm going to call Aidan Beatty Mr. President, because as far as I understand, you are the president of the American Conference of Irish Studies.
That's right. Yeah. Just recently became president. Yeah.
Okay. Congratulations.
Thanks.
So describe that. You touched on that at the beginning of our conversation here, but being Irish, living in the US, but focusing on Ireland in your work and having a very, frequently visiting Ireland at like a strong connection. What's it like living in the US right now? With regards to that, and what is the American Conference of Irish Studies like? What do you guys do, and what are your presidential duties?
Sure. So we're like an academic organization. Mainly, it would be people who do history or literature. Probably literature is a bit bigger than history. So a lot of people who do like Joyce and Yeats and those like big towering figures, Beckett, George Bernard Shaw, those kind of people. And then people who do like more popular literature or more obscure writers, people who do Irish language studies, and then people like me who do like Irish history. But it could be like we're a very multidisciplinary and open organization. So it would be people who do anything that's in any way Irish related. A lot of people who do Irish American type work. So either the history of Irish people in the US or literature written by people in the US, or even like Irish language publishing in the US, which was certainly even in the 19th and early 20th century, there's a tradition of that among Irish communities in places like Boston and New York, and then places that people mightn't think of as being big centers for Irish life, like Montana or very northern Michigan, often in mining communities where Irish people went.
Okay. There's like a history of Irish publishing in those places that some of these Irish literary scholars focus on. And
to a certain degree, or Irish language studies people would focus on, like Irish newspapers and things like that.
Nice.
So as I prior to being president, I served as vice president. That's like the standard process. You serve 2 years as vice president and then 2 years as president. So as vice president, my only really big role was...
But I mean, do any vice presidents ever not make it to... Sorry to interrupt, but it's like, is it kind of guaranteed if you're vice president that you have a shot at being president, or is there sometime like a contested election?
No, it's like it's an automatic like transfer. Like you go straight in. So essentially you're elected on a 4-year term where you'll spend 2 years as vice president, 2 years as president.
Okay. I guess and then you have a shadow vice president as president yourself that kind of learns the ropes. So they're always like the two. Yeah. Okay. I'm interested just in the procedure of organizations. It's interesting how everybody, if you're given free reign to kind of design things, a bunch of different organizational structures emerge, and it sounds like that works pretty well.
It's small enough as an organization that it's not too stressful, and there's a good network of like the former presidents and things like that, and there's an executive the person representing history, a person representing social sciences, literature, Irish language studies, gender studies. So it's nowhere near as sort of singular and potentially authoritarian as the name president might suggest. Like you're working with a large group of people, and can rely on a large group of people to help you.
But like, what do you see? What are some flashpoints in the world today for you as a historian and scholar that you're thinking about or that you're noticing? And in particular, as or maybe as an Irish person in the U.S. or just as a global citizen, because right now there's also so much tension between the EU and the U.S. And just transatlantic politics and all that. And I wonder if any of this catches your eye.
Yeah, so I would say, first of all, just as someone who is always, has sort of one foot in an Irish world to a certain degree, I think I notice a lot how Irishness gets used. There's a lot of Irish people sort of in the orbits of Trump, people like Sean Hannity, Ann Coulter, Kellyanne Conway. Like you notice Irish names coming up a lot. There's a lot of certainly like on the internet and things like that. There's a kind of a deployment of Irishness in ways that really suits hard right politics. Like there's a lot of like fake claims that are made about when Irish people came to the US, they were enslaved also, and yet they don't complain about it, and it's used as a way to like denigrate African Americans, and of course Irish people were never enslaved. It's a complete misunderstanding of early modern movement across the Atlantic by Irish people and by British people also. So I noticed that a fair amount. I think there can be a weird thing, or at least like a comfort and ease with being Irish here. You sometimes get, not just from sort of Trump supporters or something like that. I think there's the bad side of being Irish in America is people have a lot of like kind of caricatured stereotypes of Irishness, and right now it's 10 days before St. Patrick's Day, and you'll see a lot of those caricatures like erupt to the surface.
Okay, what kind of characters do you mean? Like, just because some of the listeners of this might be in Germany and never have seen this kind of stuff. Talking about like kind of leprechauns with their pots of gold and things, or
things like that, but also the kind of the stuff that probably does exist in sort of how Germans might think about Irish people. Also, like the kind of the Irish pub caricature of Irishness, right? Of like hard drinking Irish people. So that side is a bit annoying to deal with. It's not directly harmful to me as an individual, so I'm I usually can just ignore it and put it to one side. But that's definitely a part of what it means to be an Irish person in the US. So you have to deal with those stereotypes in some way.
What about people on the far right might appeal? Like, why is Irishness so welcome in that community?
I mean, I think in some ways it's a way to get away with invoking whiteness without having to invoke the word whiteness. It's a very it's a form of white European identity that you can seemingly be quite proud of, and doesn't carry the connotations of, say, I would imagine if most Americans heard about like a German pride parade, they might get very uncomfortable because their assumption would be that that's Nazism. That's just going to be unadorned, unfiltered, undiluted Nazism. There's a very similar debate in medieval studies about the ways that the far right uses images of the Middle Ages in a very false way to sort of make far right political claims. And what do you do as a medieval studies scholar with that?
You mean like around, like, say, the Crusades, for example, or
yeah, like
the
imagery of the far right is often a medieval imagery, and so you get people who might be quite interested in the Middle Ages, but for very nasty reasons and very unacademic reasons. So I think there's a certain sense within people who study Ireland in some way or another, certainly in the US, but probably internationally too, that this is something we have to be aware of and have to be very cautious of, and we'll have to kind of negotiate our way around. But maybe it's not yet as blatant a problem as it is for medieval studies.
I'll pivot to this. So this is like a question I've been asking many of this first kind of batch of interviewers or interviewees, which is with regards to death and their views of death. So like, is that something I'm interested in and that I'm exploring in this project, the broader, with the Substack and the newsletter and the other writing that I'm doing in connection with this, in some ways relates to that, but also this sense of being middle-aged, and me, I'm kind of on the fringes of academia, or maybe in like a post-academic life, thinking about, the next half of my life and what that looks like. And, like being middle-aged in some ways is you can see your birth with one eye and then your death with the other, and they're there. So, and, you can roll in like having children into there if that's who you are, and in a way that changes your relationship to this. So I don't know. That's something I'm getting all these intelligent people and talking with them. Like, I wonder what your views are on that. And maybe like, do you fear your own death or death at all? And it could be like in your academic work, you, I'm sure, confront death and the specter of death. And I don't know if it shapes your politics. I mean, most people have their political positions are that needless death ought to be avoided. So it's like, it's maybe even present for us on that level too. But in any case, that's a big setup for this question. Just like, what do you think about that? Love to hear what you think.
Sure. So there's obviously a lot of huge topics there. You had emailed me like some things we might talk about. And when I saw that question, I thought, wow, I don't think about that at all. I don't think about my own mortality at all. So I don't know what that says about me, if it's a personal thing or some kind of emotional defense mechanism to not have to think about that, even though it's coming.
Maybe it's a good. Yeah, that might be great. That might just be a sign of good mental health.
Yeah, or is it a function of just my professional identity in some way, that I'm not looking to the future and therefore to my own death at some point, whatever, hopefully 50 years from now, whatever that is. Am I always just looking to the past in some ways? The only thing I've if you're a historian, obviously you are quite aware of the problem of death, that by definition, the vast majority of the people you study are no longer alive. And so you might be studying a particular historic figure. Like I mentioned, I wish Marx had talked about religion in Ireland, because that would just be really fascinating. And you always face that problem with when you study people, that if they didn't write down their thoughts on a particular topic, you just cannot get access to that question or that thought, right? So you're always aware of like what a British historian called E.P. Thompson called the enormous condescension of posterity, that there's a limited amount of what you can know about any historic figure. And even a figure like, Karl Marx or Martin Luther or Thomas Jefferson or Winston Churchill or whoever it was, that
who were like well documented in their own time, relatively speaking.
Even with people like that, you can only know so much about them, and sort of you can't know perhaps their deepest innermost thoughts and fears and anxieties. But also, if they didn't write down their thoughts about a particular issue or a particular topic, it's lost to us now. And that becomes exponentially harder when you're talking about enslaved people or women or working class people. So I think all historians are aware of that problem. Like, actually, death is sort of a limiting factor in what you can know about the past. The only kind of direct research I've done on death as a theme is on martyrdom, and sort of the idea of people killing themselves for the nation. And I was looking at this particularly in Irish nationalism in around 1916, after the Easter Rising of that year, the rebellion that happened in that year. There are a lot of claims that people make, almost straight away after 1916, about there are 16 people who were executed by the British government after the rebellion. And there are claims that are made about, well, they willingly went to their death for the cause of Ireland. And of course, we don't know that. We don't know what was in their minds or in their hearts right as they were about to be shot by firing squad or hung. So it's a very politicized claim that people are making for reasons that are actually coming after 1916. Right? I think when I wrote about this, I said this is actually about 1917. It's not about 1916. It's about what comes after the rebellion and how a memory is being constructed. And when I was doing this, I became really interested in a historian called Jeremy Cohen, who writes on medieval Jewish history. And he has a really amazing book about martyrdom, where he makes a kind of the obvious point, but it's maybe a point that might elude some of us, that accounts of martyrdom are never actually written by martyrs themselves, because by definition they can't, right? If you are willingly seeking out your own death, you may not actually be a martyr. Martyrdom is something that can only be decided on after the fact.
Even if someone might have left like a suicide note or something, or a manifesto prior to their martyrdom, like whether they become a martyr or not, that's something that's out of their hands.
Yeah, that's a posthumous political process has to be engaged in, where some group of people have now decided that's a martyr. That person died for a good cause, and therefore we will kind of eulogize them and write very hagiographical accounts of their glorious death and things like that. So that's sort of the one thing I've written about death, is sort of the politicization of specific kinds of deaths. I was really interested at the time that this is often seen as like a way of a very, very Catholic thing in Irish nationalist culture, and it's using this really Catholic rhetoric about like, I mean, Catholicism has a kind of a tradition of martyrdom. And then this is
right?
almost like
many of the saints
secularized
are martyrs, right?
Yeah. So there are ways in which like this really borrows that rhetoric and borrows a lot of that symbolism, but it's also a potentially very un-Catholic thing, because first of all, you're dying for a nation, for a secular cause, not for a religious cause. And if you are going to say they are willingly going to their death, a martyr by definition can't actually want to die, because the person who wants to die is a suicide victim, and that's sinful in Catholicism. You should not want to die, but you're willing to do it anyway. And so if you erase like the desire for life, you're actually doing something very un-Catholic and potentially sinful. So it has a kind of
there's like a thin line there, right?
Yeah.
And actually, that I mean, just as an aside, I always try to bring in Kant or Hegel. I mean, this podcast is sponsored by the Hegel-Haus Museum, but for Kant in particular, he also opposed suicide, but not for a similar reason, but kind of separated from any particular religious dogma. And Hegel did similarly. And for both of them, it's like it's immoral or unethical to kill yourself, but it is moral to put your life on the line if duty calls, for instance. So like a soldier who dies in battle, you know, even if a soldier knows that they're going to die on the battlefield that day, it's basically certain. It's still right for them to go out, even though if it weren't in the context of war in a battlefield, then they're going out and knowing that they would die that day would be suicide, you know, like, you know, jumping into a turbulent ocean or something, and then it would be wrong. So it's weird how, you know, I guess religion and philosophy, and then maybe you're pointing to politics, has a similar type of logic, and there's like a thin line in each case. Yeah.
And I mean, all of this is very selective too, because they're doing it for kind of political ends. They want to be able to say this is glorious. So all of these like complexities and these paradoxes and contradictory strands of all this are kind of, there's an attempt to kind of smother them and just say, no, this is just easy and neat and glorious. And it's actually quite easy for these people to give their lives because they were so heroic. But of course, we don't actually know if this was like as willful as people think, as people later claim.
Yeah. Well, I mean, maybe we could touch on Joan of Arc. I don't know if you think about like Joan of Arc or the historicity of martyrdom.
Yeah, I can't say I know a huge amount about Joan of Arc other than sort of the kind of things that any educated person might know about her. But certainly, like, there's a question of historicity there that I find really interesting about specific cases of martyrdom. So there's when I was looking at this, I also looked at a comparative thing in Zionism that also has a kind of a tradition of martyrdom, and it uses a lot of the rhetoric of what in Judaism is called Kiddush Hashem, sanctifying the name of God through your own death. And there's a particular case in 1920 of a man called Joseph Trumpeldor, who is a Zionist settler in northern Palestine, and at a place called Tel Chai, which ironically means the Hill of Life. He and some other settlers get essentially into a fist fight with local Palestinians. And in the midst of the fight, someone pulls out a gun and shoots Trumpeldor, and he dies soon afterwards. And supposedly, his dying words were "Tov lemot ba'ad eretzenu," which in Hebrew means "it is good to die for your country." And it's sort of a Hebrew translation of "Dulce et decorum est pro patria more," like this very, very European Roman sentiment about dying for the nation. And then various historians have pointed out first, Trumpeldor couldn't actually speak Hebrew in any like real fluent sense. He was a native Russian speaker, so it's a bit convenient that he thought to say something in very perfect grammatically correct Hebrew at the moment that he was killed. And then
maybe he just learned that one line. It was his first Hebrew lesson, and that was what they taught him when he was working on that one.
So there's also been speculation that what he said was actually intentionally misheard. That I don't know the exact wording of this, but that the Russian word for motherfucker sounds kind of like that in Hebrew, and that might have been what he said. So you actually have this like quite squalid, sad story of like essentially a fist fight, someone getting shot and then someone cursing
on the hill of life.
Yeah, and then it's turned into something very different, right? The memory of this event is actually very different from the event itself. And that's something I think is a really interesting way to think about these kinds of political deaths and the way that they're turned into martyrdoms.
Yeah, for sure. Well, I like that. I like that, how the direction that question went in. It's like death is a cultural horizon, but life is as well. So, and it's been nice chatting with you in this very living way here.
Sure, yeah. Thanks.
And so I'll ask you my last question, which is just do you have a couple recommendations you'd like to spin out for us here?
Sure, yeah.
Related, a book, a film, an album, or mix and match of those three.
Yeah, so I'll grab two things here that I sort of got in preparation for this. The album I'm going to recommend, somewhat related to what I was just talking about, is an album called Nisht Azoy by a band called Black Ox Orkestar. They're a Canadian group from Montreal. The name in Yiddish means not like this, I think. And they're a band who I've heard interviews with them where they've said that they wanted to imagine, like, what if the Holocaust had never happened and there were Jewish kids still growing up in Poland who had discovered indie rock and basically were combining it with klezmer music, with Jewish folk music. So they combine sort of some of the styles and attitudes of like really good rock music with traditional Jewish folk music, and then they sing completely in Yiddish, at least on this record. Partly, I think, as a way to kind of find a form of Jewish identity that isn't subservient to the state of Israel and to Zionism. So they really avoid Hebrew as a language. And I also just really like the music. And they released 2 records and then disbanded, and then that would have been in around like the early 2000s, 2003, 2004, sometime around then. But then maybe 2 years ago, they got back together and released one more record that they had started playing again during the pandemic.
Okay.
Maybe
and that's one you recommended for us, the more recent one?
No, this was one of their first
Or would
records.
you start the...
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Classic.
And then maybe in relation to your question of death, I recently got interested in a historian called Robert Ian Moore. He's a medieval historian, but he recently passed away. And a long time ago, I had read this book he wrote called The Formation of a Persecuting Society, about medieval Europe and about the persecution of Jews and lepers and heretics. And then he also talks a little bit about kind of sexual minorities and groups like that and how they get persecuted. And it's just a really good study of why society persecutes people. And his argument is that none of this is actually about the actual fear of heresy or the fear of leprosy or about actual Jewish people. It's about elites using that fear as a way to create social control. So it's about the persecutors, not about the persecuted, and that you have to understand persecution in terms of the psychology and the kind of political motivations of the people doing the persecuting. So it's a very specific book about medieval Europe, but even though in the last chapter, I think he kind of resists the idea that this could be applied elsewhere, I still think it can be. So it's a book about moral panics, essentially. And then
that sounds incredibly relevant.
And then I'm going to recommend a book, maybe just kind of with my sort of American Conference of Irish Studies hat on, called The Burning of Bridget Cleary by a writer called Angela Burke, which is about a very specific incident in the 1890s in Ireland where a woman called Bridget Cleary was accused by her family of being a changeling, of being like a fake version of herself that fairies had replaced her with. And her family essentially murdered her. They tortured her and murdered her. So it's this, quite specific story. And Angela Burke, the woman that wrote this book, does a really good job of just telling the story itself, which I think as a historian, you kind of have to do, right? I do think storytelling is one of the most foundational parts of being a historian. But then she also does really interesting things in terms of using this to ask questions about what's going on in Ireland in the later 19th century, what kind of social change is underway, how are older folk beliefs disappearing. The woman herself, Bridget Cleary, is part of a kind of a new cohort of women that are more assertive, are able to make money through the marketplace. Essentially, they have labor that is outside of the family, and is that ultimately why she was murdered? That she was essentially an assertive, strong woman, and her family are actually trying to force her back into a role of being submissive, and that also she herself may not have actually known the kind of rituals through which the torture that they're engaging in is supposed to happen, where she will get tortured, admit that she is no longer a changeling, and then order can be restored. Whereas other members of her family, like her husband and other members of her extended family, were aware that there's a kind of almost like a ritualized violence that they're engaging in. So it just raises really interesting questions about social change and violence. And it's one of my favorite books about Irish history.
Wonderful. No, that sounds fascinating and frightening. And as you began to tell it at first, when you were at like, fairies and changeling, I was like, maybe this is a book I could read with my kid, And
no,
then it
it's
took
not.
a turn. I was like, okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. But still, very nice. Well, it's one to read oneself,
definitely.
Yeah. So, all right. Well, Aidan, it's been a lot of fun chatting with you. I thank you so much for being here with us.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It's been great.
So, all right, then Aidan, we'll see you soon, and everybody else, we'll see you next week for another episode of We hope you enjoyed this conversation with
Aidan Beatty.
The Deadbeat Philosophy Podcast is a co-production of Deadbeat Media and the Museum Hegel-Haus Stuttgart. For more Deadbeat content and to chip in to keep the channel going, check us out at deadbeatphilosophy.substack.com. For more about the Museum Hegel-Haus, check out hegelhaus.de. That's HEGEL-HAUS.de. Adios and auf Wiedersehen.